So, as I was saying in the last video, Palladio makes the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore, keeping in mind some of the new ideas about the way churches should be designed and decorated as a result of these ideas that spring from the Council of Trent, where it's a meeting that we'll be talking about more in the next few lectures, but a meeting that, you know, wherein the Catholic Church sort of comes together and figures out some ways to respond to the Reformation that is spreading like wildfire through Northern Europe, the Protestants who are now leaving the church, and for a variety of reasons, and the church needs to respond to it somehow. So, one of these ideas that we see in the church here is that there are much fewer distractions for the worshiper inside of the church. Palladio has created this very open and airy and light colored church that has little decoration in terms of fresco painting or altar paintings that are that could be distracting to the viewer. However, this is primarily true of what you're seeing in the nave here. On the sides and the aisles, there are little chapels with altars and decorated with altar pieces, but they're sort of, since they're sort of pushed out to the sides, they're meant to be less distracting to the viewer, who is meant to be focusing on the high altar and the Mass that's taking place at the high altar, and of course, the miracle of transubstantiation that takes place at the high altar. So, this light colored design of Palladio's interior is in contrast to the darkness of what we see in the high altar at this church. What we see here is the altarpiece that Palladio's light architecture really compels us to focus on. This is done by Venetian sculptor Danese Cattaneo and is an altarpiece that is done using a variety of bronze figures that are, we've got angels holding up a globe here where you have angels holding candlesticks on the sides. Then these figures that are holding up the globe, on top of which stands this figure. Sorry, as I was saying, the sculpture group here pointed out the angels, and you have these figures. These figures are the evangelists that are holding up the globe with the figure of Christ above here standing in triumph. Which certainly makes sense with the altar. As you'll remember, we've seen how the altar is the site where the miracle of transubstantiation takes place. And it also importantly recalls the death and then resurrection of Christ. And so his triumph here certainly makes sense. Cattaneo was an artist like Sansovino that fled Rome after the sack of Rome and was working with some other sculptors, one of whom is Girolamo Campagna. And in fact, the attribution of this altarpiece is given as sort of a collaborative effort between those two sculptors, and maybe even with Sansovino thrown into the mix. In any case, this dark light contrast is so important here, and that's echoed in the paintings that are on the sides of this high altar space. You can see just a corner of one of the paintings over here. These paintings, which we're now going to look at, were done by Tintoretto. And here they are. So this is that corner we saw in the other image. I'm right about that, I think. Yeah. And what you have on each side of this high altar at San Giorgio Maggiore is the gathering of manna on the left-hand side of the altar and the Last Supper on the right-hand side of the altar. Tintoretto was, Tintoretto, I should tell you, is his nickname. His real name is Jacopo Robusti, but his father was a dyer, and so Tinto means dye, and Tintoretto means the little dyer. And it works well for Tintoretto because I think one way to remember his painting style actually is to think about the name Tintoretto, this dyed dark style, corresponds with how dark his paintings are. You see really muted colors, lots of browns and grays, and variations of black in his work. And it makes the same sort of light dark contrast as the high altar piece, because these paintings are so dark in their color scheme. The subject matters of both paintings certainly make sense in this location, since the gathering of manna was seen as the prefiguration of the Last Supper. In that, in the gathering of manna, what you have is Moses, who is here, and he is, hang on just a sec. Sorry, it was my computer's being glitchy. I don't know if you picked up on that or not, but in any case, the painting that we're looking at here on the left is the gathering of manna. And what is taking place here is that the Israelites are resting on their long journey, and each day God would provide food for them in the form of manna, which is kind of like a, I don't know, a substance anyway that's supposed to be like bread, that would fall to the earth every day. And the Israelites would gather it up, and you can see the women are busily doing just that, would gather it up each day and would partake of it that day. And they wouldn't store it. They would just, I guess get rid of whatever they didn't eat each day, because it would go bad. So each day God would provide this new feast of manna, and that's what we're seeing taking place here. You've got Moses, who is this guy here, who is kind of sitting back, and we have this figure who is gesticulating, showing that God has provided this manna, I suppose, in answer to Moses's prayers. And then on this side with the Last Supper, obviously what we have here is the subject matter we've seen already a few times in this class, most notably with Leonardo's Last Supper. And you have Christ, who is at the table with the apostles, but you also have a new mix of all sorts of figures that have been included in here, and we'll look at that a bit more closely in just a minute. But what I would have you note is that Tintoretto has included lots of figures in each painting, so as to really get across the story and really explain the details of the story of these scenes. And that really ties into counter-reformatory art as well. This idea of art really going back to serve its initial function in the church, which was to teach the stories of the Bible. There was some talk about the fact that art had kind of moved away from that over the course of the Renaissance, especially, say, in that Mannerist period, and that art was getting too complicated, too difficult to decipher, and no longer was serving that important role of teaching the illiterate the stories of the Bible. So this kind of storytelling that Tintoretto does by including all of these figures and the gestures, and really making things quite straightforward about what's going on, ties into these reformed ideas about the importance of art in the churches and the functions that they hold. Oops. So looking at this painting a little bit more closely now, what I would point out to you is that Tintoretto has included, as a way to tell this story, all sorts of details that were not usually included in the Last Supper, like the actual preparation of the meal, which we see taking place here. We get a little view into the kitchen area where food is being prepared. Women are carrying out the food in baskets, and we can see there are several women around that are serving the food. Then we have one that's already started to do the cleaning up, it would look like, and there's a little cat that is digging in here, trying to see what's going on in the water. There's a little dog here. A bunch of details like that that just makes the story more believable, more accessible. It's not shown in a really high class setting. It's not fancy in any way, and in that way seems to be more correct in terms of where Christ was said to have partaken in the Last Supper. But also there are figures here that are dressed like contemporary Venetians. These figures in particular, the servant figures, and they really seem to be included here as a way for people to kind of see themselves in the work and thus make a connection that way and be sort of drawn in more into the work that way. In this painting, and I know it's cut off at the top, hold on just a sec. That's a bit better. Anyway, so what we see in this painting, which comes from another commission of Tintoretto's, this is for um, a, a project of a pretty typical kind of Venetian institution, which is called a scuola. A scuola is a kind of confraternity. It's like a group of men that would get together and perform charitable works and enjoy entertainments together, have discussions about various issues, and so forth. There were many of these institutions in Venice, and that these institutions would have their own buildings and they would commission artists to decorate the interiors. So it provides a great deal of work for Venetian artists and architects. Tintoretto does a number of series of paintings for the scuole. Tintoretto becomes so popular, in fact, he becomes Titian's greatest rival within Venice for artistic commissions, in part because not only is he a very capable painter, but he's also a very quick one and would paint and complete works much, much faster than Titian would. So patrons preferred Tintoretto because he could really deliver his painting so much faster and really meet the deadlines that were set in his contracts, whereas Titian usually took way longer and didn't often meet those deadlines. So Tintoretto, here what we see is a painting that he does for one of these scuole. This is for the Scuola of San Marco, really one of the biggest and most important of the scuole in Venice. And in it, what we see here is a scene where Saint Mark is performing a posthumous miracle. He is swooping down from the heavens in order to free a slave, who we see here, from being tortured. We have these kind of villainous figures here that are being shown as Turks, which relates to the conflicts that the Venetians were having with the Turks in these years. And they are seen, they've had hammers and have been beating this poor man with these hammers and sticks and other things. because he refused to sort of deny his devotion to Christ and to Saint Mark in particular, and so he was being tortured because he was a Christian. So this intervention of San Marco is, of course, an important scene here. And the way that Tintoretto has depicted it for us, we're really drawn into the scene because of the variety of the poses that are shown here and the way he's dealt with the subject matter, having this incredibly foreshortened figure of San Marco that leads the viewer into the painting and then down from there to the space of the slave, brought it, the viewer is brought in as well by this line here on the pavement, that naturally leads us to this reclining figure of this poor man. So he's really showing off his abilities in foreshortening and making interesting, complex compositions that still tell the story well. And here we see him using, a fairly bright color palette, especially for Tintoretto. In other scenes from this same series, we have the finding of the body of St. Mark. St. Mark had been buried in Alexandria, where he had died, and the Venetians decided to bring back the body of St. Mark, even though it was buried in Alexandria and in Egypt, and they decided to go there and get the body because they wanted to have an important relic of a saint um, that would be held in the Basilica of San Marco. And the Venetians went on this crusade to get the body, and they argued that had St. Mark not wanted to go back with them, he would have made his body too heavy or whatever to sort of block his transport. But since he didn't do that, then he must have wanted to go to Venice. What we see happening in this scene here is that the Venetians are inside of this church and they are taking bodies out of the sarcophagi. They are digging them out from the ground. They're just causing chaos as they are desperately seeking the body of St. Mark. So St. Mark comes in, he appears miraculously and indicates to them where they can find his body. And of course, this is meant to show us that St. Mark really wanted to go to Venice, and so their robbery of his body was okay. This is one of these kinds of scuole. This is the Scuola of San Rocco. Saint Roch or Roche was a plague saint, and because the plague goes through Venice several times in the course of the 16th century, as we've seen already with Titian, there was a real devotion to these saints like Saint Roche and Saint Sebastian, who were seen as protectors of the plague. So the Scuola di San Rocco was built, and obviously it too needed to have paintings in the interior of it. We see in this beautiful, very Renaissance exterior these repeated arches and double column motifs, which would date this building as it should be to the later half of the 16th century. In the interior, the original plan was to have a competition to see which artist should get the commission to do the paintings for the interior. And the story goes that Tintoretto snuck in during the middle of the night and put one of his paintings in place. It was the day before the competition was supposed to take place. He already installed his painting, and on top of it, he offered to do the whole project for free as long as he could be a member of the Scuola. So the members of the Scuola arrived the next day to see all the paintings that have been brought. Tintoretto's already gotten started on the project, and who could the offer of doing it for free. And so naturally, Tintoretto gets this commission. And he does all of these paintings. You can see it's an incredibly elaborate series of paintings along the walls, in the ceiling. There are altarpieces that are also done. It's really quite incredible. I have several views of it here. As an aside, this is a place where you can see concerts sometimes, and it's quite a beautiful place to see a concert. Here's some of the scenes. This is the glorification of San Rocco. You can see Tintoretto is using foreshortening, thinking about the viewer's perspective from below, but for the most part is keeping those figures parallel to the picture plane. And as I've told you already, we're going to see that change as the Baroque age dawns. Other paintings from the same series as San Rocco. This is the Adoration of the Shepherds. And this is one of the last paintings that Tintoretto does in this series. And what we see is that he's divided the scene up into two levels. And below we have the animals that are in the stable, and we have some servants that are helping out here, rather like what we see him doing in the Last Supper painting that we saw at San Giorgio Maggiore. In the upper half of the composition, we have two figures here, female figures that are attending to the Virgin. We have the Virgin here with the Christ child and Joseph over here. And then you have the opening up to the heavens above. But the setting is really quite humble, and of course it ties in more accurately to the story from the Bible about where Christ was born. And so you see Tintoretto moving away from these lavish Renaissance, typical Renaissance kind of settings, trying to get back to things being more sort of archaeologically correct. Here is a painting, the Crucifixion, also for San Rocco, just to show you, how he is so into the storytelling aspects of painting, and the inclusion of the painting of all of these figures within the painting that help really tell the story, like what we're seeing here. The cross with Christ on it has already been raised, and Christ obviously already attached to it, while we have one of the figures that will be crucified alongside Christ just starting to be raised on the cross. And you can see the physical effort involved in raising the cross, and these various witnesses watching what's going on. Same thing on this side, a group of people has come to observe what's taking place. There's a great deal of use of gesture to help tell the story. We have the other thief who is just starting to be pinned down to the other cross over here. So we get the full story told in this painting. In Palazzo Ducale, I've mentioned to you already, there were a number of fires inside of the building, which caused it to need to be decorated on a pretty regular schedule. And so this also provides important commissions for painters in Venice, and frankly it allows them to continually update the style of paintings that are in their government building. What's kind of interesting is that they always stick to the same subject matter, like fire after fire. The subject matter that artists are asked to do paintings of is always the same, but the style changes and is updated. One big fire happened at the midpoint of the century, and we see that shown here in this painting of the fire in Palazzo Ducale. You can see they're still actually building some of Sansovino's buildings here on the other side, which is kind of an interesting thing to see. one of the main spaces that is decorated is in Palazzo Ducale in what's called the Great Council Hall, and in it we have a collaboration of Tintoretto and another major late Renaissance Venetian painter, Veronese, and they do this huge cycle of paintings together. For the most part, Tintoretto was responsible for the ones along the wall, and especially we'll be looking at this painting of Paradise. And Veronese does many of the ceiling paintings, and we'll look at a couple of those. So here is Tintoretto's Paradise, and what you see here is this uh, grouping. We have Christ and the Virgin Mary here, and then you have this vision of paradise of all of these saints, members of the elite, the saved, who have been called up to heaven and are enjoying paradise. This is put here in Palazzo Ducale in this space of this big meeting hall because it was meant to serve as a reminder to the government rulers of their important function in ruling well and making decisions that would be appropriate and Christ-like, um, keeping in mind that obviously there's zero separation between church and state, especially in Venice, but really trying to emphasize the important Christ-like or Christian roles that the government has in ruling over the people of of Venice. And these images of Christ are really meant to be a reminder of that. And I would say, not only of Christ, but also connecting to that role of the Virgin as being an intercessor, and in the same way the government is sort of the intercessor for the Doge as though, ruling over and making important decisions for the well-being of the people of the city. This is a good view to show you Tintoretto's large Paradise painting back here, and then a painting by Veronese that we'll look at next of the sort of glorification of Venice. All of this is, of course, propagandistic in its function, again, to really encourage and remind the government members of their important roles, but also to elevate the idea or sort of propagate the idea of the very Christian origins of Venice, much more so than other cities in Italy, as we've talked about already. So here we have this painting, The Triumph of Venice, and Veronese, you can see already his style is so different from Tintoretto's. They really seem to have opposing approaches in that in Tintoretto's work, as we've seen, it's mostly humble-looking people in humble settings, lots of darkness. Veronese instead, it's beautiful people, beautifully dressed in beautiful architectural settings. And certainly that is true here. This gorgeous bright blue sky, these cloud formations that hold up the personification of Venice, who we see here. She's being crowned by fame. And, you have these groupings of mythological figures that are meant to show the various attributes of Venice as a city of the arts and learning and wisdom and all of those important things. Obviously, again, making important connections to the function of the government meeting in this space. Then we have people that are clearly meant to be understood as contemporaries of Venice, perhaps identifiable even at the time, that are looking up at this scene of Venice in triumph. We have horses with riders Down below, we have an image of the Lion of San Marco, which really orients us as, making it more than clear that this is about St. Mark City, Venice. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting, but very different. And again, we can see how this is up on the ceiling. Of course, we're looking up at it, but really everything is quite parallel to the picture plane still. It's not that kind of shocking illusionism that we'll see with Baroque painting, though in some areas like the underside of the horse over here, we can see that these figures have been dramatically foreshortened so that we understand depth and get a sense of that illusion. Of course, you can see in another painting by Veronese, this Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, which is on your right, that he really was more influenced by Titian than Tintoretto was. Um, and I think you can especially see that here in the comparison with the Madonna of Capezero, where Veronese has obviously employed that same kind of compositional organization and even the same sort of setting with the stairs and the columns as Titian had done in his painting. Again, beautiful figures in these beautiful settings, gorgeous costumes. It's just what Veronese does. And he was very popular. I mean, I think especially because Tintoretto and Veronese were so different from each other, you know, it allowed for both of them to have good markets depending on what your personal taste or preference was. And as we see in Palazzo Ducale, their styles are so strikingly different that perhaps we would think, why would they have them work together? But clearly they want to show the possibilities of, the great painters working in Venice at the end of the century. And I will end with this painting, though I'm actually going to talk about this painting more at another moment, I think. But this is a painting that Veronese does called The Feast in the House of Levi. And it's a painting that really explains well the challenges that some artists face in this new counter-reformatory culture. But as I said, we'll talk about it at another moment. But it certainly, just looking at it from the point of view of Veronese's style, you can see that he uses these very Roman architectural settings, and some of it even looks like a stage set, especially in this background where you have these kind of monochromatic stage-like settings. And it's important to realize that theater really was an important part of Venetian culture. Venetian opera is really starting to blossom in this period, and theatrical productions were happening all over the city. And Veronese and other artists were absolutely the ones responsible for designing these stage sets. And in many ways, the way Veronese has set up this composition, that's what it looks like, that Christ sitting here at the table is, a sort of on a stage, and then we have the backdrop behind them with this cityscape. But we'll talk about that next week.